The story begins in a serene African village, nestled between rolling hills and sprawling acacia trees. Life in the village is simple, governed by age-old traditions and deep familial bonds. The hum of daily life fills the air. Women draw water from the central well, children play in the dusty paths, and elders gather under the large baobab tree, sharing stories and wisdom. The golden light of dawn casts long shadows, heralding a new day. In one corner of the village, a modest home with a thatched roof stands, its walls weathered but sturdy. This is where Tokeyo, a young woman of 19, begins her day. Her hands are rough from years of hard work, but her eyes hold a quiet determination. Despite the hardships she faces, Tokeyo greets everyone with warmth, earning the respect and affection of the villagers. Tokeyo's life has not been easy. She lost her mother when she was only 7 years old, a loss that left a void no one could fill. Her mother, known for her gentle spirit and wisdom, was the glue that held their small family together. Without her, Tokeyo's father, Abu, struggled to manage both the household and his grief. As the years passed, Tokeyo grew into a hard-working and compassionate young woman. She learned to cook, clean, and care for her father, all while dreaming of a better future. Despite her hardships, Tokeyo finds solace in small moments, watching the sunrise, helping an elderly neighbour, or listening to the songs of birds in the fields. Her dream of becoming a healer stems from the memory of a kind village midwife who comforted her during her mother's passing. Enter Mariam, a woman with ambitions larger than the village could contain. Mariam married Abu not out of love, but for the security his household offered. She carried with her a calculating nature, always scheming to maintain her position in the village's social hierarchy. Mariam is a sharp contrast to Tokeyo. Where Tokeyo is kind and selfless, Mariam is controlling and self-centered. She quickly establishes herself as the head of the household, imposing her will on everyone. To her, Tokeyo is a burden, a reminder of Abu's previous marriage, and a competitor for his attention and resources. Tokeyo's father, Abu, is a kind but weak-willed man. He loves Tokeyo deeply, but often succumbs to Mariam's demands to keep peace in the household. Over time, his inability to stand up to Mariam creates a rift between him and his daughter. Mariam wastes no time asserting her authority. She withholds affection from Tokeyo, assigning her the most arduous tasks and criticizing her at every turn. To the outside world, Mariam presents herself as a caring stepmother, but within the confines of their home, her true nature emerges. Despite this, Tokeyo remains resilient. She draws strength from her mother's memory and the friendship she has built in the village. Her best friend, Zahra, often reminds her to hold on to hope, even when things seem bleak. Tokeyo secretly dreams of becoming a midwife. From a young age, she admired the village healer, Mama Yara, who had saved her life when she was gravely ill as a child. Mama Yara, an elder woman with gentle hands and an understanding heart, had become a source of inspiration to Tokeyo. The village healer not only tended to the sick, but also assisted in childbirth, a role that fascinated Tokeyo. She was captivated by the idea of helping women bring life into the world, the way Mama Yara had guided her mother through her illness with wisdom and care. Tokeyo often spends her afternoons at Mama Yara's home, where she learns the basics of herbal remedies and listens to stories about the ancient healing practices passed down through generations. While the world around her expects her to simply marry and take care of a household, Tokeyo harbours a quiet but powerful ambition. She dreams of one day following in Mama Yara's footsteps and becoming the village midwife. It is a dream she keeps close to her heart, sharing it only with her best friend Zahra, who supports her aspirations but worries that Tokeyo's life may never allow her to pursue them. However, Tokeyo's life begins to shift when Mariam, her stepmother, makes a decision that will alter everything. Mariam had long seen Tokeyo as a burden, too independent, too strong-willed, and too much of a reminder of her husband's first marriage. Tokeyo had become a threat to Mariam's position in the household and the village, where Mariam had worked hard to establish herself as the respected matriarch. The very idea that Tokeyo might dream of something beyond the confines of the household was something Mariam could not tolerate. One evening, Mariam sat down with Abu, Tokeyo's father, her eyes narrowed with determination. "It is time," she said coolly, her voice tinged with a subtle menace, "for Tokeyo to become a woman of her own." She suggested the idea of marriage to a man from a neighbouring village, Malik, a poor but hard-working farmer. Malik had shown interest in Tokeyo before, and Mariam saw this as an opportunity to rid herself of Tokeyo while still securing the dowry for her marriage. Abu, though hesitant, had always been weak in the face of Mariam's demands. He knew little about Malik's true character, but trusted Mariam's judgment. His love for his daughter was evident, but his inability to assert himself in his marriage clouded his actions. He agreed to Mariam's plan, hoping that Tokeyo might find happiness with Malik and settle into her new life. Tokeyo was devastated when she first heard the news. Her heart sank as Mariam and Abu discussed the marriage arrangement in front of her, their voices cold and indifferent. Tokeyo felt as if her dreams were being crushed before her very eyes. She wanted to protest, to fight for the life she had imagined for herself, but the reality of her situation quickly set in. Mariam had made up her mind, and her father was too weak to intervene. Tokeyo's refusal seemed pointless. Her life had always been defined by what others expected of her, and this moment was no different. She could not rebel against the decisions of her parents, especially not her father, whose approval she so desperately craved. In the end, Tokeyo reluctantly agreed to the marriage, not out of love for Malik, but out of a sense of duty to her father. She would honour his wishes, as she always had, even if it meant sacrificing her own dreams. The wedding was planned swiftly, and Tokeyo had little time to prepare. The villagers buzzed with excitement, as weddings in the village were seen as grand events to celebrate, yet for Tokeyo, it felt like a funeral, her dreams being buried under the weight of tradition and expectation. The day of the wedding arrived, and Tokeyo dressed in a traditional gown of bright colours, the fabrics flowing around her slender figure. Her heart felt heavy, and every step she took toward the ceremony seemed to weigh her down more. The wedding ceremony was held in the village square, under the wide shade of a tree where many such ceremonies had taken place before. The villagers gathered, whispering in anticipation as the bride walked to the altar. Tokeyo's eyes scanned the crowd, but she could not find any joy in their eager faces. Her gaze fell to Malik, standing nervously by the officiant, his face a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. She had met him only a handful of times, and though he was kind and respectful, she could not feel any affection for him. Mariam stood nearby, her face a mask of triumph. She observed the proceedings with the satisfaction of someone who had orchestrated the entire event, her grip on her position tightening with each passing moment. Her eyes flicked toward Tokeyo, but there was no trace of empathy in her gaze, only the recognition of her success in removing the young woman from the household. As the ceremony continued, Tokeyo's heart grew heavier. The vows were exchanged, the traditional blessings spoken, and the celebratory music played. Tokeyo tried to keep her composure, but tears silently filled her eyes. She blinked them away, afraid that any outward display of emotion would reveal the true pain she felt. Her wedding day, a moment meant for joy and celebration, had become a quiet tragedy for her. In the midst of the ceremony, no one noticed the tears that streaked down Tokeyo's face. To the villagers, she was just another bride entering a new chapter of life. But for Tokeyo, the wedding felt like the end of her journey before it had even begun. She could no longer dream of becoming a midwife. Instead, she was trapped in a life she had not chosen, a life she could only accept with silent resignation. As the day drew to a close, the villagers cheered and congratulated the newlywed couple, but Tokeyo's heart remained silent, burdened by the weight of her unspoken grief. She walked alongside Malik, her steps slow and heavy, knowing that her future had been decided for her, with little regard for her own desires. It was a life she had to embrace, not out of love for Malik, but out of the silent strength she had learned to cultivate in the face of her stepmother's cruelty. Her dreams of becoming a healer were now a distant memory, replaced by the reality of a marriage she had not chosen. Yet, as the night fell, Tokeyo held on to one small hope, that somehow, some way, her strength would guide her through this new chapter of her life. Life with Malik was nothing like Tokeyo had imagined. When she first arrived at his modest home, she felt the weight of the change in every corner. Malik's house was small, with walls made of mud and a thatched roof that creaked in the wind. The floor was bare earth, and the furniture sparse. Just a small table, a few chairs, and a bed with simple linens. There was no comfort here, no luxury, but there was something else. A deep sense of peace and respect that Tokeyo hadn't experienced in her father's home for a long time. Malik, though poor, was kind-hearted. He greeted Tokeyo with warmth and respect, treating her not as a mere object of duty, but as an equal. His gentle nature stood in stark contrast to the cold, calculating way Mariam had treated her. Every day, Malik worked the fields, tending to his crops, while Tokeyo helped around the house. There was a simplicity to their life, one that didn't revolve around material wealth, but rather the effort of daily labour and the joy of shared moments. In the mornings, Malik's grandmother, Mama Amina, would rise early to prepare breakfast. Mama Amina, a wise old woman with a wrinkled face and steady hands, had seen many years and countless struggles. She welcomed Tokeyo with open arms and quickly became a source of guidance for her. Despite her own poverty, Mama Amina had a wealth of knowledge. She was a healer in her own right, though not as skilled as Mama Yara. Still, her wisdom in herbs, healing, and the ways of the land was invaluable to Tokeyo, and she absorbed everything she could. Mama Amina taught Tokeyo how to identify different plants and their uses, how to make simple remedies for common ailments, and how to tend to the crops in ways that would ensure the family had enough to survive. It wasn't the life Tokeyo had dreamed of, but it was a life she was learning to navigate with resilience. Malik, too, was patient with her. He never rushed her, always offering encouragement as she struggled to adjust to the manual labour of farm life. In the beginning, Tokeyo found the work exhausting. The physical demands of life on the farm were far different from the sheltered existence she had known in her father's home. From sunrise to sunset, she worked in the fields, tilled the soil, and carried water from the well. Her hands became rough, her back sore, and her body ached in places she never knew could ache. The food was simple, consisting mostly of rice, maize, and beans, and there was no abundance of anything. Yet, despite the poverty, there was always enough to eat, and there was always a place to rest at the end of the day. Though she missed her old dreams of becoming a healer like Mama Yara, Tokeyo found a certain sense of fulfillment in the rhythm of farm life. She took pride in the work, in the small progress they made every day. She also found comfort in the quiet moments, sitting by the fire with Malik and Mama Amina at night, listening to stories of old, of the villages past, and of the wisdom Mama Amina had gathered over a lifetime. Back in Tokeyo's father's house, however, Mariam had no idea what life was truly like for her stepdaughter. In the weeks following the wedding, Mariam would proudly boast to the neighbours about Tokeyo's grand life with Malik. She painted a picture of a perfect, happy marriage, of Tokeyo living in luxury and enjoying all the comforts that came with being married to a good man. To the outside world, Mariam's words painted a rosy picture, one that made Tokeyo's situation seem far more glamorous than it actually was. Mariam would host gatherings, casually mentioning how Tokeyo had married well and how life was so easy for her now. She spoke of the many goats and cattle Malik had, of the fine clothes Tokeyo must now wear, and how Tokeyo had surely been treated like royalty. The neighbours would nod in agreement, their envy masked behind polite smiles. But none of them knew the truth, that Tokeyo's life was filled with struggle, that her dreams had been shattered, and that the life Mariam spoke of was nothing more than a fabrication. Meanwhile, Tokeyo was learning to cope with the reality of her new life. The manual labour was grueling, the poverty stark and the future uncertain. Yet despite it all, she began to find moments of joy in the small things. In the early mornings, when the sun was just rising, she would sit on the porch with Malik and Mama Amina, the three of them watching the sky change colours. In the evenings, they would share stories, their laughter echoing through the quiet night. Slowly, Tokeyo realised that her happiness didn't depend on grand dreams or material wealth. It was in the simple moments she shared with those who treated her with kindness. The villagers who lived near Tokeyo and Malik had a deep sense of community. Though they had little, they always shared what they could. Tokeyo too became part of this community. She began to connect with the other women in the village, learning their ways, sharing their struggles, and offering help when she could. Through these connections, Tokeyo began to feel like she was no longer alone. Her growing resilience surprised even herself. There were days when the burden felt too heavy, when the weight of her unfulfilled dreams threatened to consume her. But each day, she found something small to hold on to. It might be the sight of a new crop sprouting in the field, the laughter of a child playing nearby, or the quiet comfort of Mama Amina's presence. These moments, though simple, gave her the strength to face another day. As time went on, Tokeyo began to feel that perhaps, in her own quiet way, she was becoming the woman she had always wanted to be, not as the healer she had dreamed of, but as someone who had learned to live with resilience and grace in the face of adversity. Her life had not gone the way she had hoped, but in the quiet moments of connection, in the small victories of everyday life, she began to realise that perhaps her story was still unfolding, and maybe, just maybe, there was still room for her dreams to grow in a new form within the life she now led. As the days wore on in the small village, a new and greater challenge began to unfold. The skies, once filled with the promise of rain and the life-giving bounty of the land, turned grey and oppressive. The rains that had once nourished the crops and quenched the thirst of the villagers' livestock became a distant memory. The sun, unforgiving and harsh, bore down upon the earth with a relentless heat. The drought had arrived, and with it, the village faced an unprecedented crisis. Malik and Tokeyo had never experienced such hardship. The crops they had worked so hard to grow began to wither under the unforgiving sun, and the well that had always been a reliable source of water for the village began to run dry. The animals that had once grazed contentedly now wandered listlessly, their ribs showing beneath their skin. Food became scarce, and the villagers struggled to find enough to feed their families. The air was thick with anxiety, and the once bustling village square grew quieter with each passing day. For Tokeyo and Malik, this was a trial that felt both familiar and overwhelming. Life had always been hard, but now it seemed as though the very earth itself had turned against them. Despite their best efforts, their meagre harvest was quickly exhausted, and the strain began to show on both of them. Malik worked tirelessly in the fields, hoping for even the smallest sign of rain, while Tokeyo did what she could to stretch their meagre supplies, making small meals last as long as possible. The villagers, too, were feeling the strain. There was a palpable tension in the air as people began to compete for dwindling resources. They turned to the well, but it was no longer the source of life it once had been. Water had to be rationed, and tempers flared as arguments broke out over who would take the last of it. The once strong sense of community began to erode as survival instincts took over. People began to look out for their own needs first, and alliances shifted as quickly as the wind. Despite the mounting hardship, Tokeyo found herself stepping into a role she hadn't anticipated. Her growing knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, learned from her time with Mama Amina, became an invaluable resource. As the drought worsened and illness spread, Tokeyo began to offer what help she could to her neighbours. She used her understanding of plants to create remedies for the sick, helping to ease the symptoms of fever and dehydration that began to take hold in the village. Her ability to identify medicinal plants and concoct simple remedies gained her the trust of the villagers. They began to turn to her not just for help with illness, but for advice on how to cope with the drought. Tokeyo would walk through the village, checking on her neighbours, offering a kind word and a handful of herbs. Slowly, the villagers started to see her in a new light, not just as the quiet wife of Malik, but as a source of strength and guidance in a time of crisis. While Tokeyo became a pillar of support for her neighbours, back in her father's home, Mariam remained oblivious to the dire situation Tokeyo and the rest of the village were facing. Mariam's world, as always, was one of appearances and status. She had no concern for the suffering of those outside her immediate circle. And the drought seemed like little more than a temporary inconvenience to her. In fact, she had other plans altogether. Mariam, still bent on maintaining the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to, had no intention of letting the drought interfere with her ambitions. As her own resources began to dwindle, she turned to her husband for help, demanding that he borrow money from Tokeyo's father to maintain her lavish lifestyle. Mariam insisted that the money was necessary for repairs to their home and to buy food, though she had no intention of using the funds for anything other than her own comfort. Abu, as always, was hesitant, but Mariam's sharp tongue and manipulative nature quickly wore him down. She made him feel guilty for not providing more for her and painted a picture of their imminent downfall if he didn't act quickly. Tokeyo, though far away, could sense the strain in her father's voice when he spoke of Mariam's request. She knew that he would give in, as he always did, and it broke her heart to see him manipulated by her stepmother once again. Meanwhile, as the village continued to suffer, the tensions between the villagers grew. People began to hoard what little food they had, fearing that they wouldn't be able to survive if the drought continued much longer. There were whispers of bartering for water, of hoarding seeds for planting in the hopes of a better season. The communal spirit that had once bound the village together seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a quiet desperation. It was in the midst of this rising tension that Tokeyo's leadership truly began to emerge. She had always been a quiet person, but the crisis brought out something in her that she had never fully realized before. As the villagers began to struggle with their own survival, Tokeyo became the one they turned to for guidance. She organized small meetings to share knowledge of how to conserve water, how to keep their crops alive with minimal resources, and how to stretch their food supplies. Her understanding of the land and the plants became crucial in these discussions. She showed them how certain herbs could be used to purify water, how others could be made into poultices to ease the discomfort of dehydration. She had learned these skills from Mama Amina, and now they were saving lives in the village. The once quiet woman who had arrived in Malik's home, unsure of her place in the world, had now become the person people looked to for hope and guidance. The villagers, initially skeptical, began to trust Tokeyo. They saw her resilience, her determination, and her willingness to help, even when she herself was struggling. Her calm demeanour and practical advice provided a sense of stability in a time of chaos. Slowly, she became the glue that held the village together as the drought continued to ravage the land. People began to pull together, sharing what little they had and looking to Tokeyo for leadership. In a village where survival had once depended on individual effort, it was now the strength of community that would carry them through. As Tokeyo worked tirelessly to help her neighbours, she found herself developing a deeper sense of purpose. Her dreams of becoming a midwife seemed distant now, to be replaced by a new vision of herself, one who could lead and heal, not just through medicine, but through unity and compassion. The challenges of the drought had pushed her to her limits, but in doing so, they had also revealed the depth of her own strength. And yet, as Tokeyo's leadership grew, so did the distance between her and Mariam. While Tokeyo was building a new life rooted in the community, Mariam remained ensconced in her own world, indifferent to the struggles of those around her. Tokeyo could feel the growing tension between them, a quiet undercurrent of resentment that would soon come to a head. But for now, she focused on what she could control, helping the village survive the drought and proving to herself that no matter how difficult life became, she had the strength to rise above it. The drought continued to grip the village, its effects far-reaching and undeniable. The earth, once vibrant with crops and life, had become barren. Streams and wells ran dry, and the once thriving community began to fray at the edges. But despite the harsh conditions, Tokeyo's reputation had grown. Word of her leadership and the way she had stepped up to help her neighbours had spread far beyond the village. People spoke of the quiet woman who had once seemed so meek, now standing tall as a beacon of resilience. Her wisdom and kindness in the face of adversity had earned her the respect of those who had once overlooked her. Mariam, still living in her own world of comfort and self-importance, could not ignore the whispers that had reached her ears. The more she heard about Tokeyo's growing influence, the more a sense of envy and irritation began to fester within her. In her eyes, Tokeyo's newfound role was a threat, a challenge to the control Mariam had always maintained over her family. Tokeyo was no longer the fragile, submissive girl she could easily manipulate. Instead, she'd become a force in the village, someone whose presence could no longer be ignored. Mariam's jealousy grew with each passing day, and it wasn't long before she decided to confront Tokeyo. She couldn't stand the idea of a poor, village-bound woman gaining the admiration that had always eluded her. The thought of Tokeyo, in her eyes, rising to a position of leadership only magnified Mariam's insecurities. She was determined to put an end to this, to remind Tokeyo of her place. One hot afternoon, with the sun hanging heavy in the sky, Mariam made the decision to visit Tokeyo's village. She had heard enough, and she was curious to see with her own eyes what Tokeyo's life was really like. She expected to find her living in some kind of luxury, perhaps a new home, better clothes, and a life of ease. After all, Mariam had made sure to paint this picture of Tokeyo's life to the neighbours, and in her mind, it was true. When Mariam arrived at Tokeyo's humble home, her expectations were quickly shattered. The house was small, the mud walls cracked and weathered by the relentless sun. There were no grand decorations, no fine furnishings, just simple, modest living. Malik and Tokeyo were in the field, working as always, their backs bent under the hot sun. The village, too, was stark and struggling. The once vibrant market square was now quiet, with only a few villagers milling about, their faces etched with worry. Mariam walked through the village, her presence a sharp contrast to the worn faces of the villagers. She expected to find people eager to praise her, to offer their sympathy for her family's struggles, but instead, she was met with quiet nods and curt responses. No one was particularly interested in her, not even the villagers who had once admired her for her beauty and social status. Tokeyo, in Mariam's eyes, had stolen the spotlight, and it only fueled her growing resentment. Finally, Mariam made her way to the small house where Tokeyo and Malik lived. She found Tokeyo sitting with Malik's grandmother, Mama Amina, sharing a pot of tea. There were no extravagant meals, no luxuries. Instead, it was a simple, peaceful moment, an example of a life that, while difficult, had found its own rhythm. Mariam stood in the doorway, her gaze fixed on Tokeyo. Tokeyo looked up, a slight smile on her face, but there was no mistaking the hard edge in her eyes, the quiet strength that had been building within her for months. "Well, this is certainly a far cry from the life I imagined for you," Mariam said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I thought you were living in luxury, enjoying the fruits of your marriage. Instead, I find you here in this hovel, doing manual labour like a common servant. I suppose you've really failed, haven't you?" Tokeyo remained silent for a moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel her heart racing, but she had long since learned to control her emotions. She had lived under Mariam's thumb for too long, and now she saw her stepmother for what she truly was: vain, manipulative, and cruel. "You don't know anything about my life, Mariam," Tokeyo said calmly, her voice steady. "You have no idea what it's been like for me, and you certainly don't understand the strength I've had to find in myself. But I don't need your approval. I've learned that my worth isn't defined by what you think of me." Mariam's eyes widened, her mouth opening in disbelief. She had never seen Tokeyo stand up to her like this. never imagined that the meek, obedient girl she had tried to control would have the audacity to speak to her this way. For a moment she was speechless, her mind reeling as she tried to come up with a sharp retort. But Tokeyo wasn't finished. "I've lived with you, under your control, for long enough," Tokeyo continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've watched you manipulate my father, push me into a marriage I didn't want, and ignore the needs of this family. But I'm done being your pawn. I don't need your approval, and I don't need your pity. I found my own way, my own strength, and I'm proud of what I've accomplished." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Mariam stood there, her face flushed with anger and humiliation, but she had no retort. She had never expected this from Tokeyo. She had always thought of her as weak, someone she could control with ease. But now, she saw a woman who had found her own path, a woman who no longer feared her. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. Mariam opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had never been challenged like this before, and it left her momentarily speechless. The silence stretched on, thick with the tension between them, until finally, Mariam broke it with a cold, dismissive laugh. "You think you've won?" she sneered, her voice laced with venom. "You're nothing but a poor village woman who has to scrape by on the barest of scraps. You'll never be more than that." Tokeyo stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I don't need to be more than this. I'm exactly who I need to be." Mariam turned on her heel, her pride too bruised to allow her to stay any longer. "This isn't over, Tokeyo," she muttered under her breath, her words more of a threat than a promise. But Tokeyo didn't respond. She watched as Mariam stalked away, her arrogance trailing behind her like a cloud. Tokeyo knew that this wasn't the end. Mariam would never accept her strength, never acknowledge her worth, but it didn't matter anymore. Tokeyo had found her voice, and nothing would silence it again. As she watched Mariam disappear into the distance, Tokeyo felt a quiet sense of victory. She had stood up to the woman who had once controlled her life, and for the first time, she felt truly free. The road ahead would still be difficult, but Tokeyo knew now that she was strong enough to face whatever came her way. The drought that had once seemed endless continued to wear down the spirit of the village, but it also brought about an unexpected transformation in Tokeyo. Through the trials and tribulations of these trying times, she discovered her own inner strength, something she had not known she was capable of. No longer the quiet, submissive woman who had once been swept along by the tides of life, Tokeyo had become a leader in her own right. Her ability to guide others through hardship had earned her the admiration of the villagers, who began to look to her for guidance and inspiration. Tokeyo's actions had shown them what true resilience meant. It was not in grand gestures or dramatic victories, but in the small, consistent efforts to make a difference in the lives of others. Tokeyo had learned how to help her neighbours stretch their resources, preserve what little they had, and even find solace in their community despite the growing strain. She used her knowledge of plants and remedies to ease the suffering of the sick, and her steady leadership helped calm the anxieties that gripped the village. Tokeyo had become more than just a figure of survival. She had become a symbol of hope. In the midst of suffering, she'd remained unbroken. She'd given the villagers something they hadn't realized they needed, an example of quiet strength, of dignity in the face of adversity. People began to speak of her not just as a young woman who had been forced into an unwanted marriage, but as someone who had risen to the challenge of life's most difficult trials. The village elders, who had once ignored Tokeyo and regarded her with little more than indifference, now looked at her with respect. The constant pressure of the drought, combined with the trials the villagers had faced together, had stripped away the veneer of social status that had once defined their relationships. In times of crisis, it was actions, not titles, that spoke the loudest. Tokeyo's quiet yet powerful leadership had not gone unnoticed. One afternoon, as Tokeyo was helping Malik clear a section of the land where they hoped to plant the few seeds they had left, the village elders came to visit. They had seen her work alongside the others. Her tireless efforts to restore some semblance of normalcy to the village and they were eager to acknowledge her contributions. Their arrival, though unexpected, was not a surprise. The elders, with their years of experience and wisdom, knew that the village's survival had depended on the unity that Tokeyo had fostered among the people. The elders gathered in the village square, and Tokeyo was asked to join them. Malik, who had been by her side through every step of the journey, stood beside her. The air was heavy with anticipation, the village waiting in hushed silence for what would unfold. Tokeyo's heart pounded, but she remained calm, her eyes steady and unwavering. The elders began to speak, their words slow and deliberate. "Tokeyo," one elder began, "we have watched you in silence. We have seen how you have worked, how you have led our people through the harshest of times. You have not sought recognition, but you have earned it nonetheless. It is not often that one such as you, a woman who has endured so much, rises to lead with such grace. You have brought this village together in a way no one thought possible. For your strength, your wisdom, and your courage, we honor you today." The elders bowed their heads, a deep sense of respect radiating from them as they presented Tokeyo with a symbol of her newfound place in the village. It was a small, carved wooden necklace, a token of honor that the elders bestowed upon those who had proven themselves as leaders in times of great adversity. Tokeyo accepted the necklace, her hands steady despite the overwhelming emotions that swelled within her. As the villagers watched, the respect that Tokeyo had earned became apparent. The quiet woman who had once been underestimated now stood among the elders as an equal. In that moment, the veil of disdain that Mariam had once cast over her seemed to dissipate, and Tokeyo saw, for the first time, that her worth was not defined by the judgments of others. She was no longer the object of scorn, but a leader, someone who had shaped the future of the village with nothing more than her own will and strength. Tokeyo's journey had been long and difficult, but as the villagers gathered around her, their faces filled with gratitude and respect, she realized that every hardship had been worth it. She had not just survived, she had thrived. She had become the woman she had always hoped to be, a woman whose strength came from within, who had learned to rise above the expectations of those who had tried to define her. Malik, too, stood proudly beside her. His admiration for Tokeyo had grown with each passing day. He had always respected her, but now, seeing the way the village had come together in response to her leadership, he felt a deep sense of awe. He had watched as she had turned hardship into opportunity, as she had nurtured their family with a quiet determination that had inspired him to become more than the man he had been. Malik, once content to simply survive, now shared Tokeyo's vision for a better future. Together, they had worked the land, learned new skills, and supported each other through the most trying of times. Malik had come to understand the value of community, of working together, and of never giving up, even when the world seemed against them. He no longer saw himself as a simple farmer struggling to survive. He saw himself as a part of something larger, something important. He was proud of Tokeyo and determined to support her in every way he could. As the village began to recover from the drought, it was clear that Tokeyo's influence had not only saved lives, but had given the people of the village a new sense of purpose. Together, they began to rebuild what had been lost, working side by side to create a future where the community could thrive, no longer at the mercy of the land, but empowered by the strength of their unity. Tokeyo and Malik, now united in their shared vision, began to plan for the future. They worked together to create a system of shared resources where the community could rely on one another to weather any future challenges. They planted new crops, built new wells, and invested in the education of the next generation. Tokeyo, inspired by her own transformation, continued to dream of becoming a midwife. Now, with the support of the village behind her, she would continue to heal and lead, not just with herbs and knowledge, but with the compassion and strength that had defined her journey. The recognition from the village elders had marked a turning point in Tokeyo's life, but it was just the beginning. She had proven to herself and to the world that strength is not always loud and obvious. Sometimes, the greatest power comes in the form of silent resilience, the ability to endure, to rise, and to inspire others in the process. And for Tokeyo, this was just the start of a life she had carved out with her own hands. A life defined not by her past, but by the strength of her spirit and the hope she had brought to her community. Mariam's once unshakable control over her household and the community began to unravel as the truth of her actions spread. At first, the whispers were small, just murmurs among the neighbours, a quiet commentary on her behaviour, but soon those whispers grew louder, carried by the winds of gossip through the village. The more people learned of Mariam's manipulations, her cruel treatment of Tokeyo, her selfishness in the face of the village's suffering, the more her reputation began to crumble. Mariam had always prided herself on her status, on the power she wielded over her family and the village. She had once been the woman everyone looked up to, the one who held the social keys and wielded influence with a smile. But as Tokeyo's quiet leadership became the talk of the village, Mariam's deceit was laid bare. The villagers, once too intimidated or too polite to speak out against her, now began to share their own experiences. They spoke of how she had demanded money from them in times of need, only to turn her back when they were in trouble. They told of how she had manipulated Tokeyo into a marriage, not out of any real concern for her happiness, but out of self-interest. As these stories spread, Mariam's once solid foundation began to crack. The more Mariam tried to defend herself, the worse it became, her attempts to reassert control, to remind people of her position in society, only highlighted her desperation. When she visited the market, where she'd once been greeted with respect, she now found the villagers avoiding her gaze or offering her hollow pleasantries. Even those who had once respected her for her beauty and strength began to distance themselves. They could no longer turn a blind eye to her cruelty, nor could they ignore the way she treated Tokeyo, who, by now, had become an embodiment of strength and grace. Mariam had tried to ignore the gossip, to believe that her former status could shield her from the truth. But as the village turned against her, she could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down. Her isolation grew with each passing day. People stopped visiting her, the invitations to community events ceased, and her once welcoming home now stood empty, a symbol of her own isolation. It became clear that her manipulations and lies could no longer protect her. At home, Mariam's once comfortable life was slipping away. Her husband, Tokeyo's father, had remained largely oblivious to the truth of Mariam's actions, but he could no longer ignore the obvious signs of her downfall. For years, he had failed to see the depth of Mariam's cruelty, blinded by his own complacency and a desire to avoid conflict. But now, as the reality of the situation became impossible to deny, he was forced to confront the woman he had married and the role he had played in the suffering of his daughter. One evening, after weeks of tension and growing discontent, Mariam's husband finally spoke the words that had been long overdue. He found her sitting alone in the parlour, a look of defiance still in her eyes despite the mounting pressure around her. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, unsure of what to say, but then the weight of the truth forced his hand. Mariam, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I've failed you, and I failed my daughter. Mariam's eyes narrowed, her pride flaring. What are you talking about? She snapped. I've done nothing wrong. Everything I've done has been for this family. You've done nothing but tear us apart, he responded, his voice steady despite the pain he felt. I allowed you to manipulate me, and I let you destroy my relationship with Tokeyo. I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected her. Mariam's face twisted with anger. You're blaming me for your own failure, she hissed. You should have known better than to let her go. She was nothing but trouble, a burden, and now look what's happened. Look at what she's become. He shook his head slowly, the realization dawning on him. No, Mariam. She's become strong, and that's because of everything you tried to take away from her. You pushed her into a life she didn't want, and you isolated her from me. You manipulated her, and you did the same to me. I should have seen it, but I didn't. Now I've lost both of you." The pain in his voice struck Mariam harder than she expected. For the first time, she saw the cracks in her own armour, the truth that she had long tried to hide from herself. She had used her power, her beauty, her influence to control everyone around her, but in doing so, she had destroyed the very relationships she had claimed to hold dear. Her husband's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Mariam had no retort, no way to defend herself. Her life, which had been built on manipulation and deceit, had come crashing down around her. The people who had once feared her now spoke of her with pity and scorn, and even her husband, who had once been under her spell, now saw her for who she truly was. Mariam's downfall was swift. Her isolation deepened as the final remnants of her reputation crumbled. She no longer had the power to control her own household, let alone the village. Her husband withdrew from her, no longer willing to endure her lies and manipulation. Tokeyo, despite all the years of mistreatment, was no longer the silent girl she had once been. She was strong, independent, and had the support of the community behind her. Mariam's own bitterness and isolation had caused her to lose everything she had once held dear, including the very family she had fought to control. In the end, Mariam was left with nothing but her pride and her broken dreams. Her once vibrant personality had become a shadow of its former self, and the community had turned its back on her. Tokeyo, the woman she had tried so hard to break, had emerged stronger than ever, and Mariam could no longer hide behind her lies. The world had seen her for what she was, and there was no going back. Her fall from grace marked the final chapter of her manipulation and control. Mariam's power was gone, and in its place was the painful reality of a life defined by deceit and isolation. It was a fate she had brought upon herself, and no amount of pride or regret could undo the damage she had caused. The sun rose over the village, casting a warm golden glow on the land that had been through so much. It had been a long journey, one filled with hardship, pain, and growth. But now, standing on the threshold of a new beginning, Tokeyo could see the promise of a better future in the faces of her neighbours and in the work she had put into the land and the people. She had risen from the ashes of her past, stronger and more determined than ever. Tokeyo's dream of becoming a healer, which had once seemed so distant and impossible, was now a reality. She had opened a small clinic in the village, a modest space tucked away behind the home she and Malik had built together. The clinic was simple, but it was filled with the tools and knowledge that Tokeyo had acquired over the years. Her collection of herbs, medicinal plants, and books on healing. Her reputation had grown, not just as a survivor, but as someone who could bring comfort and healing to those in need. The villagers, who had once seen her as the quiet girl forced into an unwanted marriage, now sought her out for guidance and help. It was no longer just about physical healing. Tokeyo had become a symbol of hope, of resilience, and of the possibility of change. People came to her for advice, for remedies, and for the strength they had seen her demonstrate time and time again. They looked to her not just as a healer, but as a leader, someone who had shown them that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, patience, and strength. The clinic became a place of refuge, not only for those in physical pain, but for those who needed guidance or simply a listening ear. Tokeyo's healing hands extended beyond the body, as she gave advice, comfort, strength to those who came to her. Her connection to the land, to the plants, and the remedies she had learned from Malik's grandmother had given her a deep understanding of how to heal both body and spirit. It was a gift that she shared generously with her community, never seeking recognition, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had made a difference. As Tokeyo settled into her new life, her heart heavy with the memories of the past, there was still one thing left to confront: her relationship with Mariam. Tokeyo had spent so many years under Mariam's thumb, living in a world of manipulation and cruelty. But now, after everything she had endured, there was a sense of peace within her. She had learned that strength was not just about survival, it was about moving forward. A about finding peace in the face of the storms that had once threatened to tear her apart. One afternoon, as Tokeyo was closing the door to her clinic after another long day of work, she saw a familiar figure approaching. Mariam, looking older and smaller than the woman Tokeyo remembered, was walking slowly toward her. The once imposing woman now seemed fragile, her posture slumped as she neared the clinic. For a moment, Tokeyo hesitated. Her heart clenched at the sight of the woman who had caused her so much pain. But she did not turn away. Instead, she stood her ground, waiting for Mariam to reach her. Mariam stopped a few paces away, her eyes cast downward in shame. She looked nothing like the woman who had once held all the power. Her clothes were simple, worn from the days of her isolation. The years had been unkind to her, and Tokeyo could see the weight of her past hanging on her shoulders. "I never thought I'd see you again," Tokeyo said softly, her voice steady but not unkind. Mariam looked up at her, her eyes filled with regret. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she began, her voice shaky, "but I've come to realize just how wrong I was, how much damage I caused. I ruined everything, and I can't undo the pain I've caused you. I thought I was doing what was best, but all I did was tear everything apart. I've lost everything, my reputation, my family, and I deserve it all. But I've come to beg you, Tokeyo, for your forgiveness." Tokeyo stood still, her gaze unwavering. She had suffered, yes. She had been forced into a marriage she didn't want, endured years of cruelty, and watched as her father failed to protect her. But she had also learned that forgiveness was not a gift to be given lightly. It was an act of strength, not weakness. And in that moment, Tokeyo understood that forgiveness wasn't for Mariam. It was for herself. "I forgive you," Tokeyo said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of all the years of pain. "Not because you deserve it, but because I am not the woman I was before. I'm stronger now, and I refuse to carry hatred with me anymore. I've learned that forgiveness is the key to healing, for both of us." Mariam's eyes filled with tears as she took a step forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said, the words coming out choked with emotion. "I don't expect you to ever forget what I've done, but I'm truly sorry. I see now how wrong I was, and I can never make it right, but I will live with the shame of it for the rest of my days." Tokeyo nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. She had come full circle, from the girl who had been broken by Mariam's cruelty to the woman who had found her own strength. She'd done what no one had ever expected of her. She had forgiven, and in doing so, she'd freed herself from the chains of the past. As Mariam turned to leave, Tokeyo watched her for a moment. The woman who had once tried to break her was now humbled, defeated by her own actions. But Tokeyo knew that Mariam's downfall was not her victory. It was merely a reminder of the importance of strength, of the power to rise above the darkness that tried to swallow her. As the evening sky began to darken, Tokeyo walked back into her clinic, her heart light and her mind clear. She had done what was necessary. She had healed not just her body, but her spirit. She had built a new life for herself, and in doing so, she had created a legacy of silent strength, a legacy that would live on in the village, in the hearts of the people who had watched her grow, and in the generations to come. In the quiet of the clinic, as the stars began to twinkle above, Tokeyo reflected on the journey she had taken. From the darkness of her past to the light of her new life, she had transformed into the woman she was always meant to be, a woman who had found her strength not in the grand gestures of defiance, but in the quiet resilience that had carried her through. And as she closed the door for the night, she knew that her story was far from over. It was only just beginning.